delighted to see all of you back and delighted to see you sort of move forward. So hopefully we'll have better interaction. Though I must say I was quite pleased with your questions yesterday and the fact that many of you had, were on the same page as I was. So I was very pleased with that. But let me proceed. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give 2 lectures today. The first one where we left off, which is on underwater archaeology. And then I will move on to look at coastal temples, particularly coastal temples of Gujarat, and what bearing do they have on maritime networks or on maritime history. Now, I start with underwater archaeology because as one of the things that we discussed yesterday, we talked about fishing and sailing communities. You remember that was the second lecture after we had talked about the transnationalism of the Constitution of India. Now, one of the issues is how do you study these fishing and sailing communities? There are some texts, not very many, but very few texts which have or which are focused on fishing and sailing communities. You do have some texts, particularly in texts relating to the 19th and early 20th century, and I'm thinking of some Bengali novels which talk about fishing communities, and I think there's something in Tamil as well. But this is kind of a later phenomenon, as I would argue. I don't know. There may be earlier works. We do get some inscriptions which talk about donations made to Buddhist monastic sites by fishing communities who are referred to in the inscriptions themselves. But these are sort of few and far between. So how do we even know that these were there in antiquity? How do we study them? And what are our sources? So that's a general introduction to the first lecture. And to understanding particularly the boats and the ships used by fishing and sailing communities. Underwater archaeology is a very specialized field. It requires not just expertise in diving, but also expertise in doing archaeology underwater. The archaeology remains the same. The methodology of archaeology remains the same. All that one needs is special equipment to keep the divers, working and being able to breathe underwater. And the second point, of course, is that one needs to do survey, photography, and a lot of things that archaeologists do on the land that has to be done underwater. So it requires specific equipment, it requires special training, and it requires certainly some investment. This was a somewhat later development even within the field of archaeology. We had talked yesterday that archaeology itself is a 19th century discipline, is a later discipline. Underwater archaeology comes in even later within the discipline of archaeology. Now in India, there are 2 major organizations who do underwater archaeology. One is the Archaeological Survey of India. The Archaeological Survey of India, it started an underwater wing in 2001. I think that's right, yeah? Yeah. And the Archaeological Survey, that wing is somewhat in not so good a condition at the moment, but has done field work both on the Tamil coast at Mahabalipuram and also at Kaveri Pumpattinam and north of Bombay at Elephanta, and as well as some work in Dwarka, which we will talk about also. The earlier center, the first center I would argue, was at National Institute of Oceanography, where they study the sciences of the oceans. So the scientists are involved in looking at sea level changes, also various aspects of oceanography. And they've done a lot of work along the Gujarat coast, Goa, as well as Lakshadweep Islands. The third center, which came up soon after the NIO, was at Tamil University, Thanjavur. It started as a center for underwater archaeology, but kind of shifted focus to ethnographic studies. what are ethnographic studies, and what do you understand by ethnographic studies? What is this news source I'm talking about? Anybody? Yes? Yeah? Okay. Yes. Yeah, thank you. So in this case, it was the study of boats. So it was the study of present traditions of boat building. And this was a 20-year project that was given by CSIR, the Center for Scientific and Industrial Research, to NISTADS. And what they did was, the Thanjavur Center, and there were other centers, they recorded the songs of boatmen. So there was a lot of recording. You mentioned living with the communities. So they visited them, they traveled with them, they recorded their songs, but they also documented in great detail the present traditions of boat building. So there are two sources now that we are looking at. One is underwater archaeology, and one is ethnographic studies. Towards the end of this, we will discuss the individual merits and demerits of both of these. But in India, I think it's the ethnographic studies which have been more important, which have moved forward as compared to the underwater archaeology. First point is that we have no shipwrecks, no early shipwrecks in this country. I'll come to that in a moment. The earliest is from Sri Lanka. We'll talk about that. What we do have, and this I mentioned yesterday very briefly, what we do have are anchors, stone anchors, which have been found in large numbers, both across the Gujarat coast, starting from Dwarka all the way to Broch and Bhavnagar, so all along the Saurashtra coast, the Gulf of Kutch, the Gulf of Khambat. So what we have are stone anchors. We don't have shipwreck sites. And this is something we will come back to, why we don't have shipwreck sites. We did see this map yesterday briefly. And something which I would like to point out, you see there is a clustering there between Porbandar and Dwarka. That's the site of Porbandar, that's Dwarka. You have another clustering around Somnath, and then you have a third clustering here where Lothal is marked, Broch is marked, and at the head of the Gulf of Khambat. So these, please do remember these three clusters, because I think these is something that we will also talk about in the next lecture this afternoon. Do we have shipwreck sites in the Indian Ocean? We do. This is not exactly a shipwreck site. The earliest evidence for bitumen comes from the site of As-Sabaya in Kuwait. It's dated 6th millennium BCE. Why is bitumen important, and why does bitumen tell us about shipwreck sites? Because bitumen was used for coating wooden boats. Remember, the boats in the early period were all made of wood. Now, if you make a boat of wood, what happens is that it would get degenerated because of salt water, because of the organisms in the ocean, and it would decay very fast. So it needs to be coated on the outside, both to make it watertight and also to prevent it from decay and degeneration. And bitumen was used at least in Kuwait and in Saudi Arabia and Oman coast for coating these reed boats, which were made of reed. And what has been found in the excavations at As-Sabaya are marks of reed bundles on bitumen. So in a certain way, this is indirect evidence, but the incrustations on bitumen have been analyzed, and these do relate to seagoing vessels. So our first evidence is 6th millennium BCE. We have evidence of seafaring vessels from indirect evidence, which we get from bitumen. Now, the earliest shipwreck in the subcontinent, I mentioned, comes from Sri Lanka. This is a more recent find. I would say last 5 to 6 years. It comes from the village of Godavaya, which is on the southern coast of Sri Lanka. What is interesting about this site is not just that it has yielded this earliest evidence of shipwreck, but the German excavation team has conducted excavations at the site of Godavaya for almost about 20 years, 20 field seasons. They have published extensively, and what they have got is a jetty, a harbor, but also they have found a Buddhist monastic site. They have found coins, a Buddhist monastic site, seals, sealings, writing. And in addition, and I think a question that I'm going to, so be prepared for that, the question that I'm going to ask is, what does Buddhism have to do with sailing? We'll come to that, but let me just tell you about the Godavaya shipwreck site. They have also, the shipwreck site I mentioned is dated 2nd century BC to 2nd century AD. There's also later finds, which are Persian and Chinese ceramics, which date to a later period, glass ingots, wood, coins, and so on. To get, and this is quite surprising, are the saddle querns, which were found, which you see on top there, which was found from the shipwreck site. At the bottom are glass ingots, and also, in addition to ceramic bowls, there is metal that has been found at the site. And it is suspected, there's still a lot of work to be done, it's in a very preliminary stage. It is suspected that this was a boat or a ship which was involved in coastal voyaging, which was taking a lot of this material to Sri Lanka, because those saddle querns that you see up there, what do you think they are used for? Have you ever seen any of those before? And before the day of the Mixie, did you remember seeing that? Louder, I can't hear. Louder. You're sitting in front, you know, so I think you should raise your voice a little bit. Go ahead. Anybody, what is this used for? Grounding flour, any grounding, because grounding flour, spices, food items, you know, if you make vada, you have to ground the dal. So it's used for grinding. And what is quite interesting is that these querns, when analyzed, could provide a lot of information on food habits, on what was ground, what was eaten. So these querns are quite interesting from that point of view. No, before I move on to the second slide, what is the connection between Buddhist monastic sites and shipwreck sites? I had said that Godavaya has also given evidence of a large monastic site which dates to around the same period. There is a harbor. I had also shown inscriptions which mention the revenue from the trade was transferred to the monastic site. I think in the previous slide, I had also mentioned the name of this, the second point, that it refers to harbor and collection of customs duties. Now, what is the connection between Buddhist sites and Buddhist monastic sites and shipwreck sites? Anyone? I can't hear actually because I can't see because this thing is in my hand. Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Okay. Thanks. That's a good one, and I think you're right. Two issues here. One is that the king transferred the revenue or the customs duties to the monastery for its maintenance and for its upkeep. That is one. The second point, which again is one kind of historical writing, or some people have written about, is the fact that the monasteries were also centers of education, you know, in the secular sense. There were certainly centers of education in the religious sense, but there were also centers of education in the secular sense, which means centers for writing, accounting. A lot of the merchants did donate to the monasteries. The monasteries were also centers for adjudicating within society. So when we talk about religious institutions, which we will do both now and in the second lecture, you must bear in mind that these religious institutions, in addition to being centers for monks, nuns, and for religious worship and devotion, were also involved in what we would today refer to as secular fields, both education, law, as well as accounting, all of which are very important for merchants, all of which are very important also for both the king and the people who were donating to these monasteries. So let me move on. The earliest shipwreck that we get in India is from Kerala. This is the Kadakkarapalli boat, which was found in Kerala. It was excavated in 2004. It's much more a barge. You can see that it's a flat-bottomed boat. It was used for cargo carrying, and it's dated to the 11th century. And this boat, it's argued, would have been involved much more in coastal sailing. I wonder if you can see these. What you have are iron pegs or iron dowels which hold the planks together. This is something which sort of comes up in a somewhat later period. In the earlier period, what you have for tying the planks or tying these logs, these are the logs that you see, the wooden logs, you have to tie it together. And these were tied together with rope or with coir, a very special kind of rope. And that is also an issue which needs to be kept in mind when we are looking at shipwreck sites. So the most, one would argue that the richest and the one that provides most data is the shipwreck site off the coast of Sumatra in Indonesia, one of the islands of Indonesia. I'll show you it on a map in a little while. It is known as the Belitung shipwreck. This was discovered in 1998, and it was carrying Chinese ceramics. Chinese ceramics in the period between the 8th to the 10th, 11th centuries and even later were thought of as being very precious. They were collected, they were used, they were much in demand. So a lot of the shipwreck sites in the Indian Ocean do provide evidence of Chinese ceramics. But what is interesting in our case is my third point here, that some of the pieces were inscribed in Arabic verse, and the term that is used is salam. Why is this important? I mean, what does this mean? Okay, so it could be inscribed with anything. What does this mean if a Chinese shard or a pottery which was made in China, Chinese ceramics, is inscribed with an Arabic term? Does it have any meaning, or it's, yeah? Okay. Okay. Who would be the consumer of a shard which certainly is a Chinese shard, but made of, represents a Chinese pot, but has an Arabic legend? Who would be consuming it? Yeah. But the ruler would have to read the point is, if it's an Arabic, if it's written in Arabic, it has to have some meaning to the person. I mean, if I don't read Arabic, it's something given to me, I would think, it's decoration. Yeah, you had a point, yeah. Arabia. How? No, I can't understand the logic. Give me the logic. To or wherever, yeah, they were going somewhere. Okay. So why do they write in Arabic? Okay, so a couple of points that come up in this. We're talking about a producer. We're talking about the consumer. We are also talking about special requirements of the consumer. In this case, not just two entities, China and Arabia, but the consumer who wants Chinese ceramics. Otherwise, why would they be transporting all this? And a consumer who appreciates or knows Arabic, and hence the term salam, which is used there. But let me show you the whole probable route. The shipwreck was where you see the arrow, and the whole route extends from East Africa, Red Sea, Oman coast, Persian Gulf, down around India, into Indonesia, and then all the way up to China. So the points that I would make here are we need to look at where the boat was made, most likely in Oman. Oman doesn't grow teak, or doesn't grow wood, or doesn't have adequate raw material for boats. This most likely came from India, South India, where teak grows. The coir that is used for making these boats came from Maldives. The people who manned it would be a mixed lot. You have already seen that even though they were Chinese ceramics, the consumers or the people who wanted these Chinese ceramics would have been people either who appreciated Arabic or were traveling on this boat and were using this pottery. So it draws in then, even though on the map we draw nice lines, and even though we refer to it as India trade, China trade, or whatever else trade, it draws in diverse communities from all across the Indian Ocean. And I think this is important to understand when we are looking at maritime history, that it's very easy to talk about it in present political terms, but it did not work like that. What is even more interesting is that in Oman, where scholars have argued that this Belitung boat or ship was made, both Oman and Singapore have reconstructed this vessel. You can see the reconstruction. It is now displayed in a museum in Muscat. And that's the replica that you see in here. Do we have maritime museums in this country? And if we do, where are they? And has anybody been to a maritime museum? Has anybody been to a maritime museum? I can't see anybody. Has anybody been to a museum? Let's stop there. Yes, no, what? Yes, okay, what? Okay, so you've been to museums. What about maritime museums? No? Yeah.
Naval headquarters in Mumbai has a very small collection of naval heritage, especially dating back to the Maratha period. INS Angre.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Cochin has a maritime museum. I don't know if anybody comes from Kerala, but Cochin has a big maritime museum, again by the Indian Navy. Huh? Yes, but does it have a museum? Okay. Sure, yeah. The National Institute of Oceanography at Panaji in Goa, that has a museum. The National Museum in Delhi has a maritime gallery. If somebody comes from Cuttack, Cuttack has a very interesting maritime museum. And that maritime museum was earlier a repair workshop in the colonial period for repairing ships, traveling down the canal into the Mahanadi. And recently that has been converted into a maritime museum, and it really showcases Orissa's maritime heritage. So we do have maritime museums, not in places where you would expect them, but anyway, so certainly they exist, and many of them are maintained by the Indian Navy, and so certainly the Indian Navy has been both a partner and a stakeholder in maritime, in all things maritime. And they partnered with the Archaeological Survey of India in excavating 18th century shipwreck site in Lakshadweep of Bangaram Island, which is an uninhabited island. So one part of this whole exercise was the shipwreck site, finding the shipwreck site, and excavating it. The other part was trying to identify what they had found. So they had found a ship. It didn't say what ship it was. There was some bell, there was a bell on it, there was a name on it, but then, that name was used for several other ships. So the second part of this whole project was archival work. So not just finding the shipwreck site, but also studying it, trying to understand where it was made, where did it sail from, and what exactly it was doing off this coast. So underwater archaeology then involves, one, certainly diving and finding the shipwreck, but the second point is studying and doing archival work on this shipwreck. Now let me move to the ethnographic part of it. So as I've said, we don't have very many shipwreck sites. Now, why don't we have these shipwreck sites? I have been talking, I don't know if you can see the stitching here. This is a boat that you still use. It's a wooden boat, which is still used off the Andhra coast. In fact, all along the east coast of India. It is known as a stitched boat. This is actually made out of coir fiber, and it's stitched like you stitch clothes. That's a log boat where a log is taken, scooped out, and a log boat is made. Now, the point is that both of these are made of wood. They were not left or abandoned as in modern seacraft. In fact, even when it was damaged, they were used again and again. So long as a boat could be used, it was used. It was repaired by the people who were manning it on the site, and they continued to use it. So the first point then is that the remains that would be left behind are hardly existent. There's hardly anything that remains if you keep using something again and again. So this is one of the problems why we do not find shipwreck sites, or it's not easy to find shipwreck sites off the coast of India. Second point is that where would you find shipwreck sites? You would find them when they are coming to land. And most of the places where they would come to land would be at river mouths. Most of our rivers bring in silt, a lot of silt from the interior. This is muddy water. It is also it's not very hospitable terrain. So it's not so easy to dive in a sort of silty, brown, muddy water and recognize shipwreck sites. So that's the other reason, or that's the other argument which is given as to why we do not find shipwreck sites along the coast of India. We would certainly, the place to look would be river mouths where they come into land, and the place to look would not be at the coast, but in the interior. The reason being that there have been sea level changes, and even today, places which were near the coast are way inland. So it's not, trying to find a place, a suitable place where this occurs would be quite difficult. We do have a, yeah. Good point. we have what are called memorial stones. I don't have it here. I had put it in, but thought I would run out of time. What are these memorial stones? These are memorial stones. These are stones, say about 3 feet high, which are divided into maybe 3 panels. The middle panel would typically show a scene of a sea battle. So it would show a ship, people getting onto the ship, or people fighting on a ship. Particularly on the west coast of India, there are 2 areas which have yielded these memorial stones. These are dated 9th to 11th, 12th centuries. The 2 areas where these have been found, one is Goa. So anybody, if you go to the archaeological museum in Goa, you will see these memorial stones. They are, like I said, 9th to the 12th century. The other place where you do get memorial stones is Eksar around Bombay, or in the Bombay area, where there are several memorial stones again which survive. But the third point which I would like to talk about is that in Gujarat, if you look at the early ethnographers or early British travelers, Alexander Hamilton, for example, he talks about a living tradition, and he talks about many of the communities who would set up these memorial stones, Palia stones, as they are known in Gujarat, in memory of those who died in sea battles. So that is one part of my answer. So you have a lot of material evidence for the fact that there were sea battles, and these memorial stones were set up in memory of those who died on sea. The second kind of evidence comes from inscriptions. And again, this evidence is very interesting because these are inscriptions which again date to roughly the same period, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th centuries, come from the west coast, inscriptions of the Kadambas, the Goa Kadambas. These are a ruling dynasty who ruled in the area around Goa. And the inscriptions mention that the king was going all the way to Somnath for tirth, for pilgrimage. He wanted to bathe in the sea waters, and he wanted to donate at the holy tirth of Somnath. But then in the middle, his mast broke, and he was attacked by pirates. So he had to seek shelter with a friendly person on land. This friendly person was a Muslim merchant. So he saved the king's life, and the king then donates a large amount to the merchant. So we have inscriptions, right? We also have references to pirates, and these references to pirates. Now, pirate, I have deliberately raised it right at the end because Sir Francis Drake was at one time considered a pirate, though the English wouldn't consider him as such. So I think we need to use the word piracy with caution. Remember yesterday we talked about the 1st century Greek text Periplus Maris Erythrea. So the Periplus refers to pirates off the Konkan coast, particularly the South Konkan coast. It's an inhospitable coast, not very fertile, and the Periplus says, oh, you have to be careful there, there are pirates there. So there are references to piracy, starting as early as the beginning of the Common Era, and these are references along the west coast of India, along Oman, in the Gulf, so on and so forth. Now, since you raised this point, there's something else which I would also like to say here before I move on, which is that if you actually look at the way in which the ship is represented, I've talked about memorial stones, I've talked about piracy, I've talked about inscriptions. I haven't talked about forts, but that's another important component which we need to look at, Maratha forts particularly. A lot of these are on the west coast, not on the east coast. So is there one maritime tradition, or is the tradition on the west coast different from that on the east coast? And the reason why I think there are differences is again twofold. One difference is that if you actually look, we were looking at those stitched boats. These are all along the East Coast. So there is a tradition of stitched boat making on the East Coast. On the West, it's a more diverse tradition. Second point, on the East Coast, you don't get memorial stones. You don't get inscriptions which refer to sea battles. You don't get references to piracy. So what am I saying? Am I saying that there was no sailing on the East Coast? What I'm saying is that the engagement of the coastal communities with the sea was very different. On the East Coast, what you get are ships which are depicted on temples, which may come as a surprise. And I'm particularly looking at Bengal, particularly looking at 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, where there are beautiful terracotta temples which were built, right outside Calcutta all the way into Bangladesh. And these are almost 200 to 300 temples. These were all built 17th, 18th, 19th century. These temples have beautifully engraved, beautifully carved ships on them. These always show either ships being managed or maneuvered by Europeans, but they also show the zamindars enjoying life on the Ganga in these boats, in these ships. So the point is, and I think this is a larger point which we need to bear in mind, that what or how does the community engage with the sea, engage with traffic on the sea, right? So we do have much more aggression on the West Coast. I don't have an answer as to why this should be so. I need to do more research. But certainly on the face of it, we are looking at two very different engagements on the East Coast as compared to the West Coast. But we need to think more about this. Yeah.
So can you say that the ICC was a contested territory as compared to the River Bengal, wherein the coastal people enjoyed unhindered dominance?
I wouldn't go so far. I would say, I think what you need to look at, I think what you need to look at are currents. You need to look at, East Coast has more, is more volatile. You get, yeah. That is lacking. Also, there's a lot of cyclones. It's more cyclone prone. I think the other point also is that what we are looking at are very different kind of architecture. We're looking at so we are comparing apples and oranges. So we're comparing memorial stones with temples, which is not really a fair comparison. So I think we need to look far more into this. I wouldn't go so far as to write off the West Coast and say all was well on the East Coast, even though I'd love to do it, but I wouldn't want to do it. Okay, can we move on? Yeah. Did you want to add anything to it? No, okay, yeah. So I think you need to look at the wind conditions, the currents. You need to look at a whole lot of other things, landing places. The other thing which you need to look at, and I don't want to really bring it in here, are fishing where fish are found, fishing resources. The nature of the boat, the amount of sailing, the kind of sailing will depend on what are people using these boats for. So before we reach there, we need to look at a whole lot of other issues. Now, this is a map. This is just to give you an idea that it's not as if these shipwreck sites are lacking on our coast. So there's a lot of work. You can see number one, yes, is somewhere Dwarka, is up here. You can see the density of those marks. You can see the density of those numbers. These numbers represent European shipwrecks, but these have been found from archival sources. So the archival sources mention a whole lot of shipwrecks, a lot of them European shipwrecks along the Indian coast. Now, there's a lot of work because we need to find these shipwrecks. Somebody has to dive, somebody has to do work, and then somebody has to follow up and do archival work. So particularly for the colonial period, there are a lot of shipwreck sites which have been found from archival sources, but have not been excavated or have not been archaeologically examined. Now, the final point of this, this first presentation is that I would like to also talk about what in the colonial period, particularly in the period 18th, 19th, 20th century, and that's a lot of this occurs in the archives that were written not just in English, but I would assume in a lot of other European languages, which refer to the dhow. The dhow is a term which was invented by the British. It has an Arabic origin, but it is a term which is used in colonial archives for country boats. And I think we still use it in a very loose way for the country boats, for boats which were not European, non-European boats. And there's a whole lot of literature which refers to the dhow or the ship as being a common factor that unites the peoples of the Indian Ocean. Now, part of this is also a kind of romantic imaginary or a romantic thinking of the whole relationship between the Europeans and the non-Europeans in the Indian Ocean. But I think this is again something which we need to give some more thought to, particularly because in the archives, in the colonial archives, there is a lot of data which refers to trade in European ships and trade in dhows. And dhow is a term which is, like I said, used for country boats. So there is within the archives a kind of distinction that is made. There is also a kind of harking back in the archives to this kind of country trade that goes on. And even today, there's a lot of trade which does take place, particularly from Kutch, Gujarat, right down to Bombay, in country boats. And this trade goes all the way from the west coast to Socotra to East Africa. So this is something which occurs both in the archives, in literature, and Abdul Sharif, the person who wrote this, The World of the Dhow, as he calls it, the traditional sailing vessel, he worked, he's from Zanzibar. Zanzibar is an island off the coast of Africa. He was a curator of a maritime museum in Zanzibar, has spent his life studying the coastal communities of the East African coast, the Swahili sailing, and has hence written this book. We do know that as late as 1976, particularly in the Western Indian Ocean, the dhows were still used, they were still cargo carriers, and they continue to do so even today. So my last two slides then raise the issue of stakeholders. In addition to all of us who are interested in history and research and maritime history, who are the stakeholders and who really are involved in protecting and keeping this tradition alive? I've talked about the Archaeological Survey of India, which is certainly a major stakeholder. The state departments of archaeology, not so much, somewhere. The Indian Navy, yes, and the Indian Navy has been doing both in terms of partnering with the Archaeological Survey of India, but also have their own Maritime History Society, where many of the young naval officers do undertake work and do undertake some research on maritime matters. The one point that I would like to raise are coastal cities. Do cities along the coast have a stake in the ocean? And how do the cities, particularly our modern cities, see this heritage of the sea and preserving this heritage of the sea? And here I'd like to give two examples, and I would leave it to you to make, we discuss what you make of these. So I have two slides. I don't know if anybody's gone through Chennai airport. Has anybody? No. Yeah, okay. If you do, that's what you see. Now, what is this? It's a very beautiful bronze model. It's the model of a traditional fishing boat. This is a boat which still is found. This is a boat used by fishing and sailing communities. I just found it very surprising the first time I saw it because I didn't expect to find it at an airport. But we do have it at an airport. And I would like to sort of take this forward and try to understand, and maybe, with your help, how would you read this in terms of maritime heritage? This is clearly a fishing boat, okay? It is a very beautiful model. It is placed at a point where people enter into Tamil Nadu, Chennai, and presumably represents the way in which the state sees its engagement with things maritime. The second one is from Mumbai. And I hope you can see this slide, yeah? Now this, if people have been through Mumbai airport recently, they have, it's a very, they have set up what they call a public gallery, a public display of heritage. It's not just boats that they show, but there's also crafts, there's craft traditions, it's very beautifully done. And, it's right through the airport, anybody who's been through Mumbai. But what I found was this representation, and maybe I should have erased that, but I have said there is a problem here, as I see it. You may not agree. That what they should have shown is a boat of Salsette Island rather than of Indonesia. This boat occurs on a Buddhist temple at Borobudur in central Java. And it's a far cry calling it an Indian maritime heritage, but that's where it is. Now, I would like some response. I've finished what I have to say. I would like some response as to these last two slides. And am I just seeing things, or do you think there is an issue here? Anybody?
So before I comment on the last two slides, I had two questions.
Okay.
So, do we have evidence of shipbuilding sites near the coastal areas, archaeological evidence? And the second question was evidence of textual sources dealing with naval architecture. So if Indians were an outgoing community, they would have documented the shipbuilding traditions and complex technical drawings, even if it's on a parchment. So do we have evidence supporting those claims?
Yeah, okay, thanks. So your first question is, do we have evidence of boat building yards along the coast? What we have are contemporary boat building yards. Bepur is one on the Kannada coast in Karnataka. There are several others. Mandavi has a boat building yard. You remember yesterday I showed you Periplus and I showed you boats built at Mandavi. Mandavi has a boat building yard. So there are contemporary boat building yards. We do not have evidence of, archaeological evidence of boat building yards. I would not like to leave it at that. I would like to take it forward and say, why don't we have this? What we need to look at the way in which boat building was organized. How is boat building organized? It's organized in terms of a master and an apprentice. So where is the boat built? You can still see this. I mean, in Orissa coast, if you go to Balasore, or if you go to Kadalur, for example, where are the boats built? They are built on the beach. They're built under tarpaulin. They are built by a small group of carpenters. Traditionally, this is true for boat building as well as for architecture. The way it is built is in the head. It is not built on plans, on drawings, and then you transfer it. It is also linked to the way in which boats are built I didn't want to go into this, but since you've raised it, the way we build it is, the shell first. So the shell is shaped and built, and then the skeleton is put inside. The way the Europeans built it was that they first had the skeleton and then put in the planks, where a lot of planning, drawing, a lot of that was required. So my first response is that when we raise issues of boat building yards, what we need to look at is how boats were built, who was involved in it, what was the structure of carpentry or the structure of people who were building these boats. And this was really a master and a apprentice kind of a relationship. Second point is, okay, fine, you build the boat on the beach, how do you finally sail it into the sea? You sail it when the tide is low, and there are sort of planks which are placed, and you push the boat or the ship, and then it sails into the ocean and the sea. There are very beautiful drawings of a lot of what I'm saying. A lot of this also occurs in present context. So if one is to look at in antiquity, I would not get the same detail from either text or from inscriptions, right? So that is certainly missing. But if one looks at our texts, they do talk about this master, the master mariner, the master navigator, and the apprentice, and the whole lot of it. And I think what would be an excellent book to read for some of you is Sons of Sinbad. This is a narrative which Tim Severin, he did what is called experimental archaeology. So he read accounts of boats, ships from across the Indian Ocean. He got a ship built in Oman, and with a diverse crew, he actually sailed this from Oman all the way to China. And he's written this book called Sons of Sinbad. So please do read it. It's a very interesting read on the way in which boats and ships were built and sailed. Your second point was about the Navy, and whether if we were actually a maritime nation, then we should have had all these drawings. I think the point I would like to raise is we need to be careful about certain terms that we use, okay? The term Navy is a military organization of the state. Not to say that there was no contestation, there was no conflict before that, but the structure, again, was very different. So what we get in the ancient period are references to sea nomads or sea gypsies. Now, these were people living on islands, or these were people living along the coast. And, much like the whole relationship between the king and, we didn't really have an army till the colonial period. So much like the relationship between the king and the militia, there was a whole body of people who would aid the king in terms of raiding or in terms of attacking different sites. But to use the term Navy, I think, would be inappropriate, as the term Navy or the term military or any other term that you would like to use are very specific to a certain period, and they develop in a certain period, which is really the 19th and 20th century. Okay, so that would be my response to your question. And the third point I think, which is also important, is a lot of what we are talking about, or what we have been talking about, is coastal, right? There's very little, even though people draw lines across the Western Indian Ocean or the Eastern Indian Ocean. It's the British, for example. I'm not sure if I talked about James Rennell here, but the British, for example, didn't really have an idea, a good map of the coast till the early 20th century. So I think that a lot of this knowledge that we today take for granted is not knowledge that started from day one. It is knowledge which was gradually built up, and it was gradually developed on. So we cannot use those terms, that knowledge base, those maps for an earlier period. Okay? So that answers your questions? Okay. Now you have to answer my question. Yes, my question. Yes, okay.
Reassertion of India in the Indian Ocean region. So there's been a lot of talk, especially in the last 10 years, and it's trying to reclaim your, you can say, the name Indian Ocean, and that too with a great deal of vehemence. So you have organizations such as IORA coming, Project Mosam, and things like that. So I see these things as part of.
That was very, cruel cut. Okay, never mind. Yeah, I know he doesn't know. Anyway, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that's the impulse. I mean, that's the imagery which.
Okay, that's an interesting take. But then my response would be, if I agree with what you're saying, I would have expected a Chola, mighty Chola naval ship which went and conquered Southeast Asia there. Why a poor fishing boat? And do you have supporters with it? Okay, go ahead.
So, this is indicative of the quote-unquote soft power state which India is trying to project. So a Chola imperial ship would have been, you can say, a sign of belligerence. And here, if you want to project your soft power, trading vessel with traders, and that too from a location which is not in your country, would be a more subtle signature. That's my take.
Okay, thanks. That's a good way of looking at it. I hadn't thought in those terms, but anyway. Any others? And do people agree, disagree with what he's saying, or everybody agrees with you? Yes, any others? Yeah, thanks.
So, I just think it's interesting that they're in airports, because clearly it shows that, this kind of connectivity to the outer world that, exists now through flights was maybe something that, harkened back to our seafaring days when this is how people were connected. But I want to ask a related question maybe to this, and the distinction between the fishing boat and this more kind of trading merchant boat is, have we really sat down and tried to assess the difference between boats that were used for fishing, that were maybe used for coastal travel along Indian coast, as opposed to long-distance voyage ships that might have gone to these places? It's not clear to me whether the Indians were the actual guys making these trips, or were people coming to India, grabbing stuff, and then going back to where they're from. And you mentioned the dhow being the kind of common link. So I'm just curious whether we've been able to assess how much of this maritime culture was really kind of
Indian.
Long distance versus short distance, Indian versus international, whatever. So,
yeah, thanks. Actually, one of the things that I did in an earlier book of mine was I looked at fishing resources, and I also consulted a lot of anthropological work where people have looked at fishing as a resource. And I compared two regions. One was Gujarat, and the other was Tamil Nadu. Now, if you look, and this is again drawing on anthropological work, in both these areas on fishing resources and the relationship with boat building. Because it is correct that a boat is a functional, it is a utilitarian object. If you want to carry bicycles, then you need a bigger boat. If you want to carry just textiles, you need a smaller boat. So there's a whole lot of things linked to commodities, to distance, to fishing resources, if it's going to be fishing and sailing communities, which are the foundation of these ventures. And the results were somewhat very interesting. The point is that in Tamil Nadu, the fishing grounds are very close to the coast. So most Tamil fishermen go out in these rafts. And they come back, it's a day trip. So they just go, they fish, and or it used to be very, very rich fishing resource, and they come back the same day. This doesn't happen in Gujarat. Gujarat, the fishing grounds are far away from the coast. So if a person has to actually go out, collect the fish, that person cannot come back the same day. So which means that that group needs a larger boat, needs some way of sustaining the crew while they are fishing. So invariably, what one finds is that on the Gujarat coast, fishing is combined then with trading, which doesn't happen on the Tamil coast. The boats used in Gujarat are much larger, go longer distances, because if you have to trade, I mean, you can't sort of trade with the next person, you know, you have to go some distance. In any case, you have to go that for the fishing grounds. So there's been interesting anthropological work on the whole relationship between boats, the nature of boats, fishing, and cargo carrying. That's one. The second point, which I've again argued, is that I do not agree that this was an argument which was made in the 20th century, that the Europeans had the best ships, and the Periplos says, or Ptolemy says that they sailed from the Red Sea directly to the Kerala coast. A lot before the coming, I think before the 19th century, there may have been straight voyages, but a lot of it was coastal. A lot of it was the captain of the ship, not being the merchant himself, but carrying goods for others, trading goods, making profits, taking this back. You know, so it was a very complex organization of the crew and trading activity. A lot of it was coastal, and again, we get references to this in the Ganiza papers and in many other records. Now, the final point, was it Indian or in my frame of reference, I would argue that if you have to make a boat in the Indian Ocean, it cannot be either Arab or Indian or East African or whatever else. You need to get the wood from somewhere, and this happens even today. So it's not as if this was only in the ancient period. You need to get the teak from South India, from Tamil Nadu, Karnataka. The rope for tying this comes from the Maldives. The crew is always, you know, we talked about this Belitung wreck, and the fact that, you know, it was carrying Chinese ceramics, but it had Arab writings. Again, from pottery that you find in East Africa or in other places, which is again utilitarian pottery, it's very clear some of the crew were certainly Indian, but this was a mixed lot, even as it is today. I mean, today it's even though you have a ship which is, you know, maybe a Spanish ship, registered as Spain, but, you know, its crew would be very different, it would be made somewhere. So I think the boat by itself, or the ship by itself, had both diverse ancestry, a diverse crew, and carried a very mixed cargo. And this continues till, you know, till the colonial period, when there's there's sort of more complex ways of control. This control doesn't happen till the 19th or 20th century. So I hope that answers your question. Okay. Any other? What happened to my last two slides? Everybody seems to have forgotten those. Any other ideas, or everybody agrees with Ambarish? Okay. Yes? Mm-hmm. Sense of irony?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Because, so we found these images are from airports and from areas where we want to show that we're very proud that we do have some sort of maritime history, which probably many people don't know about and it's not recorded.
Okay.
But I don't think modern India as we know it, and I think it's fair to say that we're not doing enough to support this kind of historical tradition and help it to prosper and continue. Especially in industrialized India, definitely does not support local fishermen.
Thank you. Wonderful. completely with you on two grounds. I completely agree. One is that, you know, it is ironic that on the one hand we project this, which also ties in with what Ambarish was saying, you know, that we're talking about all this, our great maritime past. But we don't support the academic discipline, we don't support the heritage, and these are just fishing communities, but if you actually look at, you know, the coastal, some of the coastal structures, they're really in a bad way. So thanks a lot, and I really think that while on the one hand, as you say, we promote all this, on the other hand, we don't take that very seriously. So if there's no further comments or questions, then I move on to my second lecture. All right? Yeah. Sorry, we need to change that. Thank you. So in my second lecture, I'm going to talk about coastal shrines, actually coastal temples in Gujarat, so very specific area. Let me see, the point I'm making is taking off from here that we need to study these coastal temples within a maritime milieu, okay? So that's the point I am making. Before I proceed with, and you know, it's a very specific area because I can't do this with the entire country. I need to do more research on other areas. Before I go on to this, let me just get a sense of when do you think the earliest temple in this country, when would you date the earliest temple? Anybody has any ideas on when did this temple come up? No? Okay, let me start with a little bit of the historiography. The earliest temple is said to come up after. There are two issues that I would like to make. One is that the temple in the study of ancient Indian history is often linked to a political dynasty. So you have a Gupta temple, you know, Chalukyan temple, so on and so forth. Now, what is the link between a temple and the political dynasty? It's often argued that the temple provided legitimization to the state. And there's a lot of literature, a lot of secondary literature, which argues in this way, that temples came up in the middle of the first millennium AD, that means around 5th, 6th centuries AD. The Guptas, who are often known as the dynasty which had a very prosperous reign, they introduced the temple, and the reason why temples came up was that many of the kings in the first millennium AD were not really of the proper Kshatriya lineage, so they needed Brahmins to support them and to legitimize their rule. This is something which you will read in a lot of secondary literature, all right? So that is something which is given, which people write about. Another thing that people write about is art and architecture. So they talk about the temple structure, how it was made, is it made of stone, what is it made of, you know, and the sculpture on it, and the deities, the iconography, and so on. I'm going to argue against both of these, and let's see if I convince you. So my position is against both these propositions. So I'm neither looking at the connection of the temple with the state or the political dynasty, nor am I looking at art and architecture, okay? So let's see where that goes. My point is, we have not looked, and this is really thanks for raising it, we have not looked at, in this country, temples along the coast. Why would you need a temple along the coast? You know, if you want that, or if you think that it is legitimizing the state, then the best place to have it would be the capital of that kingdom. Why the coast? The coast had very few capitals or very few centers of political power. So the first point is, why have a coastal temple? What does this represent? My second point is that we have marginalized the importance of a temple or a shrine because we have, in a way, sort of ghettoized it in terms of religion. A temple in an earlier period did much more. We've just talked about, a little earlier, about Buddhist monastic sites. We talked about the fact the king transferred revenue. We talked about the fact that it was really providing social cohesion, anchorage. So a temple needs to be looked at in cultural and in social terms rather than in religious terms. So this is my second objective in doing this. The third point that I would like to raise is, which I may not be able to expand on today, is that we often think of maritime history or maritime connections as these poor fishing, these illiterate fishing communities who had nothing better to do, but they were bottom of the scale, and all that they were doing was fishing and sailing these vessels. I would like to argue that it was part of a literate tradition. Writing was used, and writing here was used not in terms of inscriptions, but in terms of writing on pottery, writing on things on containers which carried commodities and so on. So this is my third point. Now, if we look at Gujarat, let's start. We're looking only at Gujarat here. The earliest temple I had said was the Gupta temple. It's much earlier, 1st century BC. Where does it come from? It comes from Padri. This was archaeological excavations done by Deccan College at the site of Padri, Bhavnagar district at the head of the Gulf of Khambat. That's also a site which has yielded larger settlements, sites along the coast. So it's a very early temple. It was to a fertility goddess. It's not a Sanskritic deity, Shiva, Vishnu, so on. So the beginnings of the temple in Gujarat start very early, as opposed to what I had just said. Second point, between 6th and 10th century, you have a lot of temples on the coast. All the way from Dwarka right down to Somnath, Veraval, and then Bhavnagar. So there is a whole range of coastal temples. I will just show you a map and some of them in a moment. And my third point is that the primary route between 10th and 13th century was a coastal route. Again, I talked about inscriptions earlier, where kings were traveling along these. But essentially, the point I'm trying to make today here is that if you plot these coastal temples on a map, if you plot stone anchor finds on a map, if you plot fishing villages on a map, there is an overlap. What does this overlap mean? What is the relationship then between these fishing villages, between finds of stone anchors, clearly some maritime activity in the early period, and the temple? So that is the issue that I'd like to talk about. In addition to these fishing villages, there's also a lot of archaeological evidence of coastal settlements in Gujarat as early as 500 BC to 300 AD. And I've shown these clusters. Again, you see the same names coming up: Porbandar, Somnath, Talaja, and then further on Bhavnagar, as well as around Mandavi. These also we talked about yesterday. Many of these sites had links with the Persian Gulf all the way down the Saudi Arabian coast. We saw this slide yesterday where I talked about the nautical traditions, the specificity of the routes, and the fact that many of the fishing villages are at, where these red arrows are marked, are at many of these sites which we have been talking about, and that these fishing villages, these people traveled all the way from Myanmar to Zanzibar, Aden, Persian Gulf, and so on. Again, this is something we talked about a little earlier, the stone anchors, and the fact that we have this clustering. Now, what do these temples look like? This is at the site of Pindara, which is a little south of Dwarka. This temple is right on the coast, the slide that you see on top. It's a very modest temple. It's not the kind of temple, not of the same stature or grandeur as Somnath. These are very modest, small temples. They have some sculpture. They have no inscriptions. So we don't have inscriptions, and so we don't have adequate inscriptional data from these. But many of these sculptures are in a bad way because they are being eroded by the salt and and the sea water. The sites where you have these temples again starts from Padri somewhere here, which is the earliest 1st century BC temple, and then we start from Dwarka all the way down Somnath, and again a clustering here. So you can see that the distribution is clearly coastal. The distribution has a maritime orientation and looks out onto the sea. Excavations have been done. This is excavations which was done by ASI. This is in the forecourt of the Dwarkadhish temple. I don't know how many of you have visited it, but the site is preserved. The Dwarkadhish temple, as you see it at Dwarka today, is a much later temple, is a much newer temple, but in excavations which were done by the Archaeological Survey and preserved at the site show that at least a 10th century temple was present there. And there are some early dates. I had mentioned these as we were talking about yesterday. What you also see, and this is a site which is north of Porbandar. What is interesting and certainly is remarkable, there is a temple on the top of the hill. That's a 10th century temple. This is a Harshad Mata. It's a place of pilgrimage. People go, they climb up to the temple, and they do worship at the temple. The image is no longer an earlier image. It's a newer image, so the image has changed, which also happens at many places. But what is very interesting is that if you look out that way towards the sea, this is a creek. So the hill is just by the side of the creek, and the temple on the other side looks out at the ocean. You see the fishing village at the bottom, at the base of the hill, which is at the base of this temple. So is this just a coincidence? Is it just that, the temple happens to be in a hill, the fishing village has to be on the coast, so is all of this a coincidence? One question which came up yesterday when we were talking about how do you recognize the coast, and we had discussed that the coast is recognized on the basis of certain structures which stand out. And certainly if you have a temple on a hill which marks the coast, it makes it a very prominent structure which will guide mariners and navigators. Then there are copper plate inscriptions. Not from the same site, but certainly from a little further north, from Kathiawar, from a site called Lohata in Kathiawar. It's a 6th, 7th century copper plate inscription. And it gives 73 regulations. These regulations are all written down, regulations for merchants who are trading in this area. And the copper plate is an inscription addressed to the king. It asks the king to please abide by these customary regulations of the merchants. So, there are far too many regulations for me to talk about here. There are only 2 regulations which I think are very interesting. One regulation says that if people stay away for more than a certain period, for more than a year, they are not required to pay an entrance fee on their return. So one of the regulations that the king accepts is that people from the area can certainly stay away for 1 year, and when they re-enter, they don't have to pay an entrance fee. And this comes back to the point. So clearly there is maritime activity which allows them, or which, for which they stay away almost a year. The second point, which is very interesting, and I found this quite interesting, is that there are a lot of containers, a lot of commodities referred to in this inscription. But what it also says is that if the commodities are meant for a temple or for a religious shrine, then the tax on that is lower. So clearly there is more than one rate of taxation. And the taxation which would be charged on commodities required or being donated to a temple is much lower than for other purposes. So one is this inscription, which really places the temple in the much larger milieu of merchants, of commodities, of taxation, and of the larger milieu, the social milieu. The second inscription that I would like to talk about is a 13th century inscription. Now, this 13th century inscription has many donors, and it talks about gifts that these donors made to a temple. And the people who made these donations, they include merchants, but the term that is very interesting for our purposes is nauvitakas, people who are knowledge about ships. So clearly, people who are engaged with shipping, with traveling, with maritime activity, are making these donations to the temple. In addition, and then you have many of these, many of the others who are making also this donation. So it's not just the nauvitakas or the captains, but it's also merchants, shreshtis, traders, goldsmiths, and many others. So now, how does one locate this temple? How does one locate these inscriptions within the larger milieu of what was happening in Gujarat in the period between the 8th and the 14th century? And what exactly was happening in Gujarat at this point of time? Sorry. So what was happening in Gujarat is that already by the 8th century, there are fortified settlements. And these fortified settlements are connected to the coast. And we have very clear evidence through inscriptions, again, of these connections between the fortified settlements and the coast. And the settlement that I'm going to particularly talk about is Patan. Patan was the capital of Gujarat before Ahmedabad. Is even today a very beautiful town. I'm not sure if anybody has gone there. No. Yes, okay, wonderful. What did you say? Sorry. Thanks, Rini. Patan is really beautiful. You should be proud that you went there. So I'm delighted that you did. Patan is, They're forgotten. So the town that I'm talking about, the capital that I'm talking about is Patan, okay? And its connection with the coast and what is happening in Gujarat at that point in time, so that we can place what is happening in our temple and our inscriptions within this larger milieu. So one point clearly, there was very clearly the Chalukyas who are ruling Gujarat from Patan, I said before Ahmedabad. Second point is that there are many communities who do move into Gujarat or into the west coast around this time. Again, there's been archaeological work for the Parsis. We do know that in addition to many other groups, Muslim merchants, groups from the Persian Gulf. We also know of Parsis who are moving in. And again, excavations have been done on the coast, which provides data or evidence for this. and people who've been to Patan, I hope, have seen Ran Ki Vav. Excellent, which is the most beautiful step well. It is now a World Heritage Site, and is really a remarkable piece of architecture as far as India is concerned. So we have all this activity happening in Gujarat at this point in time, but we also must not forget that Patan was not only a capital, not only a political center, it was a center for learning, particularly for Jain learning. There are a large number of manuscripts which are written there. There's a whole lot of learned scholars who lived in Patan at the court, were patronized by the court, and produced a lot of literature. So, in fact, one of the earlier, one of the Indian archaeologists involved in deciphering the Ashokan inscriptions, the Junagadh inscription, which we talked about yesterday, really used many of these manuscripts from Patan, the Jain manuscripts, which talk about Mauryas, but not as Buddhists, as Jains, for deciphering this. So so Patan, is quite extraordinary, and also as a major center for learning. So now, if we look at its connections, Patan is up there, where the arrow is. Which are linking Patan both to the coast. Bhadreshwar is the arrow that is on top there in Gulf of Kutch. I've marked Dwarka, Porbandar, where we have our temples. There's Somnath. So what we see are that these temples were not isolated, standalone structures on the coast, but closely linked to what was happening in the rest of Gujarat, closely linked to some very prominent early settlements in the interior, and there is both land route along the coast as well as routes which link it to the interior. That's the Ran Ki Vav, great step well, and that I just put in because I think it's quite extraordinary and remarkable, and I'm really pleased that it's got the World Heritage status now. Now, the point I also want to raise is the merchants in literary imagination. We talked about Patan as a center of learning. Something which has not been explored to the extent that it should is the literature. The Jagaru Charit, which is a biography of a merchant called Jagaru, and he made a lot of money, and he was very close to the king. But when there was famine, he donated, very generously. So there's a whole lot of literature which emerges between the 7th and the 14th century, which really, talks about the merchants, talks about their voyages, and in this case, in Jagaru's case, he sailed for Hormuz. He had regular ships going to Hormuz. He saved Bhadreshwar, which we saw on the previous map, from famine. He saved Bhadreshwar from attacks. So there's a whole lot of literature which emerges at this point in time, which links Gujarat to the rest of the world. And of course, and this is again, I think that this is something which is completely under-researched, under-studied. The fortifications of 14th century urban centers, not just in Gujarat, but in other places. This is from Dabhol. Should I ask whether anybody's been to Dabhol, has seen these fortifications? If you haven't, please go there. It's not very far and has the most extraordinary fortifications around the town, 14th century fortifications, which survive also at Patan, but also at Dabhol. So in my final section, I'd like to consider what is the relationship between the shipper and the local community. We started by looking at the temple. We started by looking at the overlaps. We started by placing the temple in the larger cultural milieu. We traced the role of the merchant, the connections between the interior and the coast, also these various communities involved in donations. Now, I think finally we need to look at what is the relationship between the shipper and the local community. And I think this is really an extraordinary inscription, but there are many such. This is the Somnath Veraval inscription. It is a 13th century inscription. It is written, it's bilingual, so it's written in Sanskrit and also in Arabic. What is really fascinating is that it's not a translation, so one is not translating the other. It records a donation. It records a donation of a Nakhuda, a captain, Navika. His name, he's from Hormuz, the Arabian Gulf. And he makes a donation for the maintenance of a mosque. The Sanskrit term for mosque is dharmasthana. Dharma, religion, sthana, place. So the donation is made for a mosque by this Nakhuda, the captain, the mariner, the Navika, who comes from Hormuz, from the Gulf. He can't make a donation without the local community. I mean, you know, the local community has to support this donation, and the local community has to protect the Dharmasthan, otherwise it cannot move forward. So this inscription then records that he sought the help of the local Jain community. You remember our merchant, Jagaru of Jagaru Charit. You know, he was a Jain, he traded. I've talked about Patan being an important Jain center. So the inscription, this extraordinary inscription, talks about the acquisition of land. Land was in local hands, naturally, for this endowment. It talks about shops which are there, and it also then talks about the local community supporting this donation and allowing this mosque to come up in the Somnath Veraval region. The two versions, the Arabic version and the Sanskrit version, as I said, are very different. They're not the same. They're not a translation of the other. And this has to do with the way in which writing is done. And I think we saw it yesterday, maybe slightly, because in the Sanskrit tradition, there is a particular way you would write, whereas in the Arabic tradition, there's a very different way. So the inscription then follows the respective traditions. Now, this has been read by historians in a variety of ways. Some have argued that this shows an amicable relationships between the Hindus and the Muslims. But I think the way I would like to read it is that it's a complex relationship between the shipper, between the local community, between the temple, or the shrine. In this case, it's a dharmasthana, a masjid, not a temple. But this inscription then signifies or denotes this very complex relationship where the mariner or the navika cannot function without the local community. The merchants need the support of the king. The king is also a supporter of learning, of education. The temple is not just, I don't believe that it's a legitimizer. I would argue that the temple is an anchor for society. It provides adjudication in terms of law. It's also a place where medicines are provided, so on and so forth. So the point then is that this inscription, which comes from Veraval, draws in a whole different dimension of what we've been discussing so far. It also draws in the whole connection, which we briefly saw yesterday between Gujarat and the Arabian Gulf, and the fact that at that point we saw the Greeks, the Greek writing, and the Hellenistic settlements, but what we are seeing in a later period is a somewhat different relationship and with different communities that are involved. And there are many communities who enter Gujarat at this point. I talked about Parsis. There are also tombstones, Islamic tombstones at a lot of sites. There are the Jews. There are very interesting letters which are exchanged by the Jews who then trade also settle in Gujarat. So the period that we are talking about is also seeing a lot of sort of moving into Gujarat of a range of communities and a range of people. So where do we go from here? I'm going to stop here. And I'm going to argue that something which I've been saying all along, that we need to look at not just texts, fishing communities, but also we need to look at coastal heritage sites, routes which connect these sites to inland centers, but much more, and I have not talked about here very much on this. I sort of briefly raised it in the previous, those Bombay and Tamil Nadu examples. The thought that I would maybe like to have more discussion on is the protection of heritage, the protection of maritime heritage, not just protection by the state. The state can never do it. What I think is important is sustainable development. Whatever we decide, whatever we do, we talked about this, that it's no point writing books when the communities themselves are marginalized. So I think what we need to think about while we talk about maritime history, we talk about maritime heritage, and we talk about all these coastal centers, is how do we protect them? There's a lot of destruction going on, not just in Gujarat, everywhere in India. And I'm very pessimistic that 10 years down the line, we'll have half the monuments left, which we have today. So clearly, there is a problem, there is an issue, not just in terms of studying it, but as citizens and as responsible people, I think we have to protect this and we have to take this forward. So with that, I will stop.